The first of the 1966 missions will be Gemini VIII, scheduled for March. In late October, the Gemini VIII spacecraft was in simulated flight testing at the McDonnell plant in St. Louis. The target docking adapter, which will be used on the mission's Agena target vehicle, was tested concurrently to ensure systems compatibility. A transponder mounted in the extended boom will amplify and return the spacecraft's radar signals during rendezvous operations. The Gemini VIII primary flight crew, Neil Armstrong and David Scott, participated in an altitude test of the spacecraft. The test validated the environmental control system and other key spacecraft functions. In further preparation for the Gemini VIII mission, astronaut Scott practiced extravehicular activity aboard an aircraft flying parabolic trajectories. During the Gemini VIII mission, Scott will leave the spacecraft cabin and work his way to the rear of the adapter section. There he will strap on the extravehicular support package before commencing a 90-minute excursion around the spacecraft.
Early in the program, experts sit down and analyze the Gemini VIII flight. They know it is a 3-day mission. Its primary purposes include rendezvous in space with an Agena target vehicle, the first docking in space, and a 2-hour spacewalk by pilot David Scott.
Okay, starting on your left is Major Dave Scott, who was the pilot of Gemini VIII. Next to him is Neil Armstrong, the command pilot for Gemini VIII. We have Commander Charles Conrad, who's the backup command pilot, and Lieutenant Commander Dick Gordon, the backup pilot.
I'm unfamiliar with the mission. Could someone go through it, please?
Let Pete do that. We'll find out if I know. The mission, pretty simply in a short timeline, is an M=4 rendezvous with the Agena, which is the same as the 76 mission used. In other words, they'll rendezvous in the 4th orbit. And there are a series of one orbit at Neil's discretion to station keep, because his next station keeping will be in a hard suit. So he wants to get practice station keeping. And so sometime during the 5th or 6th rev, they'll do the first docking. And at that time, there's a couple of tests that are outlined in the flight plan to perform, which have to do with the Agena and the Gemini docked. We're looking at the two platforms to see if there's a difference in alignment between the Gemini platform and the way the Agena is aligned. A few things like that. And then they'll essentially go into a rest period. And at the end of 24 hours after liftoff, or starting the next morning, they'll have gone and done their EVA preparation and go into the EVA portion of the flight plan, which Dave has outlined as really 3 steps. The first dayside pass is on the 25-foot umbilical and has to do with taking care of 3 experiments, the S9, the S10, and the D16. If you're not familiar, the S9 is a nuclear emulsion, and they'll hand that piece of equipment in to Neil because they're going to bring it back in the spacecraft after the flight. The S10 is this micrometeorite experiment that's mounted on the Agena, and he's going to open that up. And the D16 you saw is the tool. Then they go into the night side where Dave goes around to the back and hooks up all his equipment to the backpack, which is mounted in the adapter, and he will ride out the night side back there. And at the beginning of the next dayside pass, Neil will undock from the Agena, and they'll go into the second dayside portion of the flight plan, which consists of a series of maneuvers, Dave practicing different things and see if Neil might be able to pick him up if he was unable to maneuver. We've got several things we want to look at. And after that, the EVA is over, they get back in and restow the spacecraft. They're going into a re-rendezvous maneuver with the Agena. And this will be without the use of the radar and the computer, but they will use the platform, and they're going to try and use a sextant and do an optical rendezvous, and this is an equiperiod one, which starts the separation at the beginning of a night side pass, so that the the whole rendezvous is done in the day side. And after that, then Dave's going to do some docking, and let's see, you do some more docking, and then they continue with the rest of the experiments through one more whole day. They're going to rest that eats up the second day, and they get their sleep period, and then they go into the rest of the experiments with a retro fire at roughly 70 hours, about 3 days. That covered for you?
It did now. If we have a couple Agena propulsion sequences in there, that might be of interest.
Yeah.
Like the Agena secondary propulsion system while docked and the primary propulsion system while undocked, and hopefully catch some pictures of it.
I'd like to ask Major Scott if he would dwell a little bit on his training for EVA and how difficult it has been, and do you expect to have any trouble using a 75-foot tether?
Well, that's a big question. Lots of answers to it. We spent, as you might expect, a considerable amount of time in training. Dick and I have participated in, I guess, somewhere around 300 parabolas in the zero-G airplane. And we've exercised the EVA equipment extensively, not only as a training exercise, but also participating in the development. And all four of us have sat around the fireside discussing these various aspects of the mission. And I think it's developed to the point now that we're all confident it'll work as expected. And it's been very interesting training for it, and I think we've learned quite a bit. We're attempting to do a number of things during the EVA portion of the flight plan, which we hope we can do in the time allocated, but our idea is to go into this with a plan that we can follow logically step by step and take our time and do everything right. And if perhaps we don't accomplish everything we'd like to, we still will feel that it will have been successful. We're not in any hurry up there to do anything. We've trained for many things, but our goal is to spend the time as usefully as we can and make the overall mission as meaningful as possible for succeeding missions.
Wally Schirra seemed to think that the docking operation wouldn't be particularly difficult. What about this? How do you feel, Neil? What about the possibility of nudging that thing into a tumble?
I think Wally's comment was largely correct. We feel quite confident based on experience in the 76th flight that we can certainly maintain attitude relative to another spacecraft very well. Your question is a good one, however, in that the knowledge of what happens after the vehicles touch, the so-called post-contact dynamics, are not as well understood as we would like them to be, but we feel quite certain that we have plenty of margin in the design of the latching mechanism to take care of any of these transients at the contact time.
Neil, would you go into a little more detail on what you're particularly concerned about on this post-contact dynamics after docking? What worries you?
I'm not a bit worried about it. As I say, I think we have more than adequate margin built into the damping system on the target docking adapter, which is the adapter to the mounted on the Agena to which the spacecraft latches. And as was pointed out in the previous question, when you do touch, you're going to expect some reaction on the part of the other vehicle. It's going to tend, and the amount that it reacts will depend on how hard you hit it and how squarely you hit it. And it's going to be our intent to hit it as squarely and firmly as possible at just the right velocity the first time.
Jeff Thompson.
It is the Agena has an attitude stabilization system, and the spacecraft does. Fortunately, they're in the proper direction so that if you do have misalignments at the time you touch, these stabilizing systems will tend to minimize or remove the misalignments. So we think we're in good shape there. It'll be interesting to see just how the other vehicle does react at the time you make contact.
The flight was simulated from an adjacent room in the Mission Control Center, Houston, and like many other things in the space age, flight simulation is done by computers. The primary and backup crew for Gemini 8 will undergo 11 days of such simulated flights before launch day, March 16th. The experts devise problems that could occur, some simple, some quite challenging. They feed these problems into a computer and sit back and see what happens, perhaps with a little glee. At any rate, the crew in the simulator and the controller at the console are given the problem. Both must respond correctly. About 90 problems will be run for the Gemini 8 mission. On the schedule are 2 days devoted to the Agena target vehicle, 4 days devoted to network simulations, and 2 days scheduled for running re-entry simulations, including emergency re-entries. 11 days of problem solving. Most probably none of them would turn up during the flight. But if one should, the crew and the 5,000 people in the ground network that support these two men would be ready. Several days before Gemini 8 will leave the ground, the USS Boxer steams toward the primary recovery zone where the mission will normally end. It begins training its complement of officers and men in recovery operations. Instead of launching amphibious strike missions, the Boxer now launches helicopters for search and retrieval of astronauts. On board is the commander of the Western Atlantic Recovery Forces, known as Task Force 140.3. 2 ships, 6 helicopters, and 6 aircraft are assigned to this task force. All 5 manned Gemini flights to date have been recovered as planned in the primary zone. Still, 10 more ships, 54 aircraft, and 5,000 additional men will be deployed at different stations around the world for recovery. There are 9 other planned landing areas lying within the 3 major zones of the Eastern Atlantic, the Mid-Pacific, and the Western Pacific. In the Western Pacific, the USS Leonard F. Mason, a destroyer, begins exercises on the retrieval of a boilerplate model of the Gemini spacecraft. The Mason will cover 3 landing areas within Zone 3. It will be backed up by aircraft from Okinawa and Japan. The chief difference between the primary area where the Boxer is stationed and a secondary area such as this is the comprehensiveness of coverage. The number of aircraft, ships, and recovery specialists on station.
Good morning. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and David Scott are reported good breakfast eaters at this moment over in the crew's quarters on Merritt Island. Both faced up to the usual high-protein breakfast of steak and eggs that will keep them in top form for the tricky rendezvous and docking maneuvers scheduled in the Gemini 8 flight later today. The only reported problem in an otherwise smooth countdown is in the Gemini spacecraft, but it is not at this time considered critical. The intercom between the 2 pilots is faulty. Nevertheless, it is functioning clearly on 2 of its 3 modes. The astronauts will bypass the fault by using volume control. Technicians worked on it all night without requiring any holdup in the other launch support operations that are essential to the countdown. The Agena target vehicle on top of the Atlas rocket out on pad 14 is getting final fueling, and that launch pad will be cleared shortly. The tower is being moved away. The Agena is scheduled to lift off at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and achieve orbit in about 6 minutes.
T-minus 11, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. We have ignition.
There's ignition, and the Atlas rocket showers its pad with a bright burst of flames.
It's airborne now, and it's rising into the sky, a beautiful liftoff. It's a smooth flight. Everything is going as it should be. You can now hear the thunder as it sweeps across our NBC observation point. Giving those rattlesnakes and alligators out there a pretty good shaking, I would say. It's a smooth flight. She looks good.
Our flight plan was a relatively complicated one, and it depended very much on the launch of both vehicles occurring very precisely on time. We were unable to see the Atlas Agena as it lifted off, but we were informed of its progress by our spacecraft test conductor from the ground, and very encouraged to find out that its launch was on time and its orbit was a good one.
And the most single difficult part of today's mission has just been achieved. The Agena rocket, which misbehaved, malfunctioned last October 25th, is now working perfectly. In an excellent orbit, as perfect as could be hoped for, as Mission Control puts it, the countdown proceeding smoothly at pad 19 for the scheduled 11:41 a.m. Eastern Time liftoff of the Gemini VIII spacecraft atop the Titan II rocket. The hatches in Gemini VIII were sealed a few minutes ago, 15 minutes ago to be precise, at T-minus 98 minutes, just a few minutes behind schedule, but the lost time has been made up at the pad, and all is on time as of now for that 11:41 a.m. liftoff of Gemini VIII.
Periodically during the first orbit, we were informed as to the status of the Agena. And when we found it was actually in precisely a 160 nautical mile circular orbit, we were, of course, extremely relieved.
0. We have ignition.
And we have a liftoff at 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Neil Armstrong reports the clock has started. Roll program is in, Armstrong says. 20 seconds into the flight.
The launch itself has to be described as perhaps one of the greatest thrills that can ever be encountered by a pilot. The launch vehicle performance was flawless. We had a slight amount of vibration during the early phases of the flight until we became supersonic, and the ride was extremely smooth from that time on.
And mark, 50-second mark. And Dave Scott gives us his first report, the cabin pressure at 5.7. Everything looks good. The distance now from the Cape about 4 miles. Altitude 24 miles. One minute, 30 seconds into the flight. The flight director's just been advised. Thrust looks good. Mark, 1 minute plus 40 seconds. And the crew's advised they look good. That digital command system update has been received in the spacecraft, and Scott has depressed a little button on the right side which indicates to the ground that it was received. Flight Dynamics says we're go for staging. We're 2 minutes, 10 seconds into the flight. The ground gives Gemini VIII a go for staging. Into the flight. Spacecraft now about 52 miles downrange. And Armstrong says we have
At staging, time when we separate from the first stage of the launch vehicle and ignite the second stage, we encountered a small fireball. This was reported for the first time in Gemini VI and is apparently a function of the individual characteristics of the timing of the staging sequence. This amounts to flying through a little bit of the exhaust from your own second stage rocket engine ignition. At this time, we felt that we had some deposit on the window as a result of this small fireball. This was again reported by Schirra and Stafford on Gemini VI.
And communications have been reasonably good, is sharper than we can recall in any past launch. 4 minutes into the flight. Flight director's advised his controllers to stand by for a status check. He's checking each one of them now. He's gotten a go from all positions here in the control center. Bill and Jim Lovell, our Capcom, has just advised Armstrong that he has a go from the ground.
It was intended to maneuver the spacecraft immediately after second stage engine cutoff to the correct velocity vector to get in the proper orbit. The Gemini launch vehicle, however, put us in a very precise orbit, and no maneuver was required, with the exception of 5 foot per second maneuver used to separate from the second stage.
And Armstrong advises they have completed their burn. They are free of the second stage.
With 2 good orbits, target vehicle and spacecraft, Gemini VIII had a head start on rendezvous and docking. The maneuvers for rendezvous would be essentially the same as those performed by Gemini VI.
The maneuver sequence involves 9 separate maneuvers to place the spacecraft in the best possible position for the terminal phase of the rendezvous.
This is Gemini Control Houston. About 2 minutes ago, Neil Armstrong called in over Tananarive, and he was able to confirm at that time that radar lock had been established.
Roger. Do you have solid radar lock on with the Agena? Over.
That's affirmative. We have solid radar lock. Just a second, I'll give you our current range.
Roger. Thank you. Sounds good.
We're indicating 178 miles range and elevation of about 4 degrees.
After radar lock-on, the crew will circularize their orbit inside that of the target vehicle.
Okay, we've got a visual on the Agena at 76 miles.
Roger, understand. Visual, Agena 76 miles.
We proceeded in on the relative trajectory to the Agena until about 1.7 miles, at which time Neil began the manual visual braking phase.
We are looking at the left or command pilot's window as the station keeping exercise with Agena begins. Gemini VIII had no difficulty in maneuvering in the vicinity of the Agena.
Hello, Houston. This is Gemini VIII. We're station keeping on the Agena at about 150 feet. Way to go, partner.
You done it, boy. You done a good job.
Do the thing.
Boy, look at that sucker.
That's beautiful. See the dipole?
Do I ever? I see everything with that fella.
Man, that's great.
Man, that is really slick.
A bit of all right.
Okay, the first thing we really have to do, platform parallelism, 650 to 710. And they're giving us the SPC loaded yaw maneuver. It looks like at nominal time. So they're going to give you that time. I'll check your whole status display for you. I bet those Lockheed guys are just jumping up and down.
The S10 is on.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's very easy to maneuver around the vicinity of another spacecraft, easier than we had expected it to be.
After station keeping for 35 minutes, Command Pilot Armstrong begins to move in closer to Agena, preparing his final docking approach. Both vehicles are traveling at approximately 17,500 miles per hour. We are looking at the target docking adapter end of the Agena. The command pilot makes a docking approach by applying very small thrust increases to Gemini VIII. The maximum velocity difference between the two vehicles at docking will be about 1 foot per second. When the command pilot is about 2 feet from the Agena, he will pause until he gets a go from the Rosenaught Victor.
The docking was performed over the Rosenaught Victory off the coast of South America, and so that data could be received on the ground during the time of contact. This, however, was just at sunset, and you can observe here that the sun is very low off on the right side, right horizon, and illuminating the right side of the Agena, while the left side and docking cone are in darkness. We stopped at approximately 2 feet out from the docking cone and waited until the Capcom on the RKV told us that he had good telemetry, and which took about 2 minutes.
Okay, Gemini 8, we have TM solid. You're looking good on the ground. Go ahead and dock.
There's docking contact, essentially at night. As you can see out my window, it was quite dark. We saw no electrical discharge or sparks at the time of contact as the spacecraft touched the whisker.
Flight, we are docked.
That was it. 2 vehicles docked for the first time in space.
And then docked at a closing velocity of approximately 3/4 of a foot per second, approximately 9 inches per second, plus or minus 3.
Shortly after docking, the crew was slightly surprised when Jim Lovell, the spacecraft communicator, checked in with this caution.
Roger, 8, reading you loud and clear. I have some information for you. Ready to copy?
Stand by. What kind of information is it?
If you run into trouble and the attitude control system of the Agena goes wild, just send in command 400 to turn it off and take control with the spacecraft. Did you copy that?
Roger, we understand.
7 hours after liftoff and 27 minutes of normal docking, an excessive yaw and roll motion occurred. The crew punched up 400, but the trouble was not in the Agena.
Dave reported the spacecraft was diverging. And looking at our attitude indicator, we found that our attitudes were indeed changing in yaw and roll. And the rates began to increase to the point where we felt the structural integrity of the combination was in jeopardy.
Unable to find an immediate answer, Mr. Armstrong undocked.
We reduced the rates to a point where we felt the undocking could safely be performed without a chance of recontact between the vehicles, since there was rotation in essentially all directions. We wanted to be assured that we could get far enough around away from the Agena before some recontact between the vehicles was encountered.
The roll rate continued to build up, reaching about 1 revolution per second. Struggling to regain control, Mr. Armstrong was forced to fire the re-entry thrusters and gradually reasserted control over the spacecraft. Neither crewman experienced any loss of orientation. Gemini never approached a critical structural strain.
Gemini 8, CSQ Capcom, contact, how do you read? We got serious problems here with the controller coupling end over end, and we're disengaged from the Agena. Okay, we get your spacecraft free indication here. We're showing you spacecraft
CSQ flight.
Go ahead, flight.
Did he say he could not turn the Agena off?
No, he says he is separated from the Agena and he's in a roll and he can't stop it. His reg pressure is down to zero, his own reg helium pressure. Gemini 8 CSQ.
Once the re-entry thrusters are fired, there is the possibility of fuel leakage in orbit, leaking of fuel essential for re-entry.
Of course, we were extremely reluctant to give up the flight at that point, but the decision to re-enter in a condition like this with our re-entry control system activated is decided before flight, when you can calmly and coolly decide what the best situation or best reaction to any given emergency might be, and seemed reasonable to agree with the ground recommendation at that point and prepare for a recovery.
The flight had been highly successful through 27 minutes of docking, but final action rests squarely on the shoulders of this man, the flight director. A decision came quickly. Fuel readings were too low. Abort. The NASA coordinator leans over toward the DoD console. We want to recover in 7-3. The DoD manager immediately punches the button, which puts him in contact with Pacific Recovery Control, Hawaii. Hawaii alerts the captain of the Mason. He swings around and heads for 7-3, making 30 knots. Search aircraft scramble from Okinawa. They will be over the predicted landing point 10 minutes before the spacecraft splashes down. 2 aircraft from Okinawa were originally assigned here, but 5 others were quickly alerted and added to the recovery team. As Gemini 8 begins its 7th and final revolution, weather is excellent in the splashdown area. Gemini 8 sweeps past Ascension Island. Retrofire will come up over Kano, Nigeria.
The retrofire, fortunately, was located close to Kano, Nigeria station, and we were able to hear the people in Houston counting down for retrofire. The view out the window, again, is a spectacular one. The view of the ionized sheath of very high temperature gases coming off the spacecraft, the view of the spacecraft retro adapter burning up some several miles behind the spacecraft. I wish I'd had more time to look out during that time period, but I thought it was imperative to stick pretty close to the steering commands given on the panel. After we put our drogue chute out at 50,000 feet, Dave read out the latitude and longitude. We're very close to what we had expected.
The spacecraft is over the coastal century.
When Gemini 8 is only 3 miles away, a C-54 catches sight of it on the main landing parachute. After that, landing is almost routine, and Gemini 8 landed within 2 miles of the predicted impact point.
The landing sequence worked completely the way it was supposed to. The parachutes all worked fine. Splashed down somewhat of a jolt, and started concerning ourselves with recovery.
Also, shortly thereafter, 2 SA-16 amphibians came over, and we didn't expect them to land because of the sea state, but they did circle, and there was quite a group out there for a while. Finally, over the horizon, after we had opened our hatches and had a good rest there, we saw the USS Mason coming full bore, and I'll bet that's the fastest that destroyer has ever traveled in its 22 years of life. They came alongside, and it was a matter of about 4 or 5 minutes from the time we got to the bow as the ship passed by that we were on board and the spacecraft was on board, and I want to say that was an extremely professional operation. Those people knew what they were supposed to do, and they performed it rapidly and extremely efficiently.
In the control center, capsule.
The first order of business this afternoon will be a replay of these tapes, including some released last night. We'll start with Tanana-Reeve after the docking maneuver where they're discussing the upcoming events, and go right on through the retro fire. I think is the last thing where we hear from Armstrong right after retro fire through Kano. I think it takes some 40 to 42 minutes in all, and there's some dead air in between, but not very much. So, Doyle Hodges, can you roll those tapes?
Gemini 8, Gemini.
Tanana-Reeve has LOS.
Just to follow up, I didn't hear any indication in the voice level that would suggest that there was any strong emotion being displayed in the voice. Was that what you meant last night?
No, that's not what I meant, but if that's what you meant, that's perfectly all right with me.
I think we were quite pleased with the way that crew behaved, and I think you'll agree with me that they behaved quite phenomenally under a very a trying situation, and they'd be complimented for that.
Mr. Schneider, there's a mission rule that stipulates that if the RCS system is activated, the mission must be terminated shortly thereafter. Could you explain why does this mission rule exist?
That's because the reaction control system is necessary to stabilize the spacecraft during reentry, and therefore whenever the reaction control system is activated, the mission rule states that reentry must be considered.
Mr. Schneider, could you give us some sort of itinerary for the crew? Do you know what time they'll reach the Cape, what time they'll reach here?
I'm afraid I don't. Our instructions or our request is that they return to the Cape just as soon as possible. We do not know exactly what the turnaround time for the aircraft will be out of Okinawa. However, they will try to expedite it and get the crew back there so that we can begin our normal debriefing sessions.
We would expect to have that by late this afternoon, say after 5 o'clock, if all these ETAs hold up. All right.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be back in Houston among all our friends here. We had a exciting ride. We accomplished a lot of things. We wish we could have done a few more. And we'll be spending this week with the staff at the Manned Spacecraft Center completing our debriefings. Dave?
Well, I haven't too much to add to what Neil said. We're going to do some more work looking into the results of the flight. We're glad that you got to see some of the things we got to see up there. It's really fantastic. And also might put in a good word for our friendly recovery forces, who we think did an outstanding job. Thank you.
Subsequent investigations determined that the violent roll and yaw reaction was caused by the spacecraft's number 8 yaw thruster short-circuiting in the open position. While several experiments were not completed and will have to be rescheduled on later missions, Gemini 8 achieved its primary goal, the first dock in space. It was a significant step in perfecting an operational Apollo capability.